Okay, so the Titanic, it's been over a century, and this ship, it still gets to us, you know? And you've been doing some really interesting research, sending me articles, even your own notes. It seems like you're hooked on something more than just the love story, huh?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, don't get me wrong, the movie's one thing, but the real story, the truth of it all, it's something else.
Right. And that's what we're all about here, right? I mean, we all love a good historical drama, but you're really diving into the nitty-gritty here. The engineering, what was going on socially, all those decisions that were made that night. You're kind of like a detective piecing together this puzzle, huh?
Well, I think we both share that fascination, don't we? I mean, how does a ship labeled unsinkable meet such a tragic end? It's hard to wrap your head around.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's start there. This whole unsinkable thing. Was that just hype, marketing?
hmm
Or did people really truly believe that back then?
One of the articles you sent over digs into this, and it turns out even the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, they were, well, a little more careful in their brochures, let's say.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they called it, and I'm quoting here, practically unsinkable.
Practically unsinkable. Oh, man, the irony. Right. But I guess it was a different time. I mean, it was the early 1900s. Everything was about progress, technology leaping forward like crazy, and shipbuilding was right there in the thick of it.
Absolutely. You had this feeling in the air, this real sense of optimism, like we could achieve anything, even conquer nature. I mean, some people might even say there was this element of hubris,
Oh, yeah, for sure. And the Titanic, it was like this grand symbol of that, wouldn't
Yeah.
you say? This incredible feat of engineering, a statement to the world.
Right. One of the articles you sent had all these amazing details about the ship's size, how luxurious it was. It was like 882 feet long. They had Turkish baths on board, a grand staircase. I mean, it wasn't just a ship, it was a floating palace.
A floating palace sailing into the night. Yeah, it's almost like Shakespearean,
Yeah.
setting the stage for tragedy.
And speaking of stages, well, the stage was also set for tragedy in a way most people didn't realize. That article about the Titanic's construction, the one with all the blueprints, it mentions some pretty big flaws.
Oh.
Yeah, issues with the watertight compartments, something that might seem, I don't know, insignificant at first glance, but
Ended up being crucial.
yeah. And here's the thing, these compartments, they were supposed to be the Titanic's safety net. Like the idea was if one part of the hull got damaged, the compartments could be sealed off, preventing, the whole ship from flooding.
Oh, okay, so a safety feature.
Exactly, like
Yeah.
a safety feature. But, and it's a big but, they weren't completely sealed at the top. So if enough compartments flooded, the water could spill over from one to the next.
Ah, so like a domino effect.
Exactly, a domino effect. And those dominoes, well, they started falling that night. And it all started, of course, with an iceberg.
And that iceberg, well, from what I read in your notes, it wasn't exactly a secret, was it? I mean, there were warnings, right? Multiple warnings about ice in the area.
Oh, yeah, there were definitely warnings. And even with those warnings, one of the accounts I read, it mentioned the Titanic. It was going pretty fast that night. I mean, close to its maximum speed.
Why on earth would they be going so fast? Knowing there were icebergs out there, it doesn't make sense.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, there was probably a ton of pressure to stay on schedule, get those passengers to New York on time. And then there's that whole, well, overconfidence maybe? Like this belief that it couldn't happen to them, that the Titanic was, well, unsinkable.
Wow. So you've got this pressure, maybe a little arrogance mixed in, and then, well, we know the consequences. And even if they'd seen the iceberg sooner, there's another thing. Weren't there not enough lifeboats for everyone on board?
You hit the nail on the head. That's one of the things you uncovered that really floored me. Think about it. The Titanic, it could carry over 3,500 people. But it only had lifeboats for, get this, about a third of that.
A third. Wait, were there no regulations back then? You'd think?
Believe it or not, they were following the law. Can you imagine that? Building this massive state-of-the-art ship and not being required to have a lifeboat for everyone on board.
It's just unbelievable, really, especially knowing what we know now. But it wasn't just the number of lifeboats, right? It was also about who got to use them.
You're exactly right. It's like you said earlier, this wasn't just a disaster, it was a tragedy. And you can't talk about the Titanic without talking about social class. Back then, it dictated everything, even in a life or death situation.
Yeah, and in this case, first-class passengers, just by virtue of where they were on the ship, they had much easier access to the lifeboats than those in second or third class.
Exactly. So even when faced with this disaster, this massive sinking ship, the rigid social lines of the time, they held firm. That's a tough thing to think about. These invisible barriers, these social structures, they were literally deciding people's fates, even as the ship was going down.
It really makes you think about the whole thing differently, doesn't it? I mean, you've got this massive ship, the ocean, people fighting for their lives, and even then, those social hierarchies, they didn't budge.
No, they didn't. And yet, you've got this other side of it, too. In your notes, you mentioned something really powerful, that detail about the band playing on as the Titanic sank.
Oh man, that one gets me every time. Can you imagine knowing what was happening, knowing their fate, and still choosing to face those final moments with, I don't know, with courage,
Mm.
with grace? It's incredible.
It really is. It speaks to something, doesn't it? That even when faced with something unimaginable, we still have this capacity for, I don't know, resilience, for meaning, for comforting each other. And their story, it's just one. I mean, there were so many acts of bravery that night. Passengers, crew members, helping others into those lifeboats, putting others before
It
themselves.
makes you wonder how people even process all that, all those emotions happening at once: terror, selflessness, panic, courage.
It's like you're seeing all of us, all of humanity laid bare. And as you pointed out in your notes, there are those figures, those stories that we're still debating even now. Captain Smith going down with the ship, and J. Bruce Ismay surviving when so many others didn't.
Right, exactly. I mean, the captain, it's almost this legendary thing. Going down to the ship, but was it the right call? And then Ismay, the owner of the White Star Line, he survived. And so many people saw it as, I don't know, a failure of leadership, like he abandoned his post.
Oh, for sure. It sparked outrage. I mean, think about it. These weren't just some guys caught up in a disaster. They were figures of authority, and their decisions, their actions, or even their inaction, it had huge consequences.
It's easy for us to look back and judge with 100 years of hindsight. But in that moment, with those impossible decisions, it makes you think.
It does. And that's why, even after all this time, the Titanic is still so fascinating to study. It's not just about the what, but the why. How did human decision, I mean, big and small, lead to this? How do people react under that kind of pressure? What can we learn from them? The good and the bad.
So, okay, the Titanic sinks, word gets out eventually. But this isn't like today, right? It's not instant news. What happened? How did the world react?
It was a slow burn. I mean, news traveled by telegraph back then. So you had these reports trickling in, then hitting the newspapers. And at first, disbelief. Nobody could believe it, that this unsinkable ship, this symbol of human achievement, was gone.
They thought they'd conquered the sea, right?
Yeah, and the sinking of the Titanic, it exposed that. It showed everyone how dangerous the ocean could be. It forced them to rethink things, the regulations, the safety protocols, everything.
So what changed? What came out of this? I mean, something that big, there had to be some major changes.
Oh, absolutely. For one, and it seems obvious now, but ships had to have enough lifeboats for everybody. I mean, every single person on board, no exceptions. And then there's the International Ice Patrol. It was formed specifically because of the Titanic to keep an eye on icebergs in the North Atlantic.
Wow, so at least some good came from it all. Some progress was made to prevent another disaster like that.
Yeah, it's a bittersweet legacy, you know. Lives were lost, but even with those changes, those lessons learned, the Titanic itself, it remained lost for decades.
Lost, but definitely not forgotten. And that makes the discovery of the wreck back in 1985, well, it's just incredible, isn't it?
Absolutely. That footage, you know, those images of the Titanic just sitting there on the ocean floor, it's haunting, but also kind of amazing.
It's like this lost world, perfectly preserved, and suddenly there it is. But it wasn't just about the visuals, right? I mean, they learned a lot from the wreck itself. Like, it debunked some of those myths that had been floating around for decades.
Exactly. For example, there was this whole idea that it sank in one piece, you know, intact. But when they found the wreck, it was obvious it had broken in two.
Wow, so it's like even more tragic in a way.
Yeah, and you know, it's a sobering reminder, isn't it? I mean, we can build these incredible things, these feats of engineering, but nature always has the last word.
It's humbling. It makes you think.
It does. And you know, it's easy to forget with all the stories and everything that this wasn't just some, I don't know, some metal structure. It was a ship full of people.
What?
Over 1,500 people lost their lives. So yeah, finding the Titanic, it was about solving a mystery, sure. But it was also about acknowledging the sheer scale of the tragedy, remembering those who were lost.
You're right. It's a gravesite, a final resting place. Sometimes you can get so caught up in the details, the how and the why, that you forget about the human cost.
It's true. And those stories, those human stories, They're what keep people fascinated, even after all these years. I mean, look at how many books have been written, documentaries, even a blockbuster movie.
Speaking of, we can't forget about James Cameron's Titanic. Sure, it was a Hollywood movie, but it brought the story to life for a whole new generation.
It did, and I think it tapped into something, that fascination that we all seem to have with the Titanic. It's not just about the shipwreck, it's a symbol.
Mhm.
It makes us think about our own mortality, the choices we make, how fragile life really is.
Big questions.
Yeah, big questions. And they're still relevant today, aren't they? I mean, what would you do in that situation? It makes you think.
It really does. And I guess that's why, even after all this time, all the books, the documentaries, even our own little deep dive here, the Titanic still has this hold on us. It makes you wonder, what is it about this story? What is it about this one ship that keeps drawing us back?
That's the question, isn't it? Maybe it's that combination of history and human drama, the grandeur of it all, the hubris, the tragedy. It's like a Greek tragedy. It reminds us that the past isn't just something in a textbook. It's filled with real people making real choices with consequences that echo through time.
Well said. And to you, our listeners, if this has sparked your own curiosity, I encourage you. Keep digging. Explore those sources. Look at the different perspectives. See what resonates with you.
There's always more to learn, more to uncover, more to think about.
Exactly. And who knows what other mysteries are out there just waiting to be discovered. Until next time, keep those questions coming. Keep exploring.